I'm Katherine Appleton. I'm from Bournemouth University, and I was asked to come and talk about some of the public health related questions that need answering and potentially could be addressed by a more meaningful measure or more comprehensive measure of dietary sweetness. I'm hoping as well I might answer some of the questions that have come up already, but also I'm going to provide a lot more. So we'll see. Okay, so first of all, by way of background, I'm sure we're all aware the World Health Organization currently recommends both children and for adults that we reduce our intake of free sugars, or that intake of free sugars should be reduced to less than 10% of total energy intake for health reasons. And in fact, the reduction to less than 5% of total energy intake would have additional health benefits. The recommendations are there based on reported associations between sugar consumption and increased risk of dental caries, type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and increased reported associations between increased energy consumption and overweight and obesity. In order to facilitate this reduced sugar consumption, we've already heard the World Health Organization and many other public health bodies also recommend reducing our consumption of sweet taste. This is reducing dietary exposure or reducing our consumption of sweet taste regardless of source. So sugars, sweeteners, naturally sweet tasting food items such as fruit are all equally eligible here. The suggestion here is that essentially reducing our consumption of sweet taste will reduce our preferences for sweet taste and will reduce our sweet taste intakes, as we've already heard today. A suggestion that would counteract the suggestion that increasing our exposure to sweet taste results in increased preferences and increased intakes, the original sweet tooth hypothesis. Despite these recommendations, however, there is currently very little evidence to suggest there's any such association between exposure, preferences and intakes. And so what I've got put up on the table there, or on the slide there, a review of ours recently conducted to investigate exactly this question. We find very little association between exposure and preferences and intakes. But to go through some of the details, or to kind of make it more convincing, I want to give you some of the details of the review. It was a systematic review of the published evidence. As Paula said, there have been other reviews available, but none of them systematic. So this one, a systematic review of the published evidence to answer the research question, does dietary exposure to sweetness in humans impact on the subsequent generalised acceptance, preference, choice and or intake of other sweet foods or beverages in the diet? We searched 3 academic databases over all years of records. For all articles we could find that included a sweetness term, an exposure term and an outcome term. We limited our searches to articles that have been published and those that have been published in English, but our intention was to make it as inclusive or as comprehensive a search as possible. We also added to our database searches by looking through the reference lists of included research articles for any that might have been missed by the database searches. Articles were considered suitable for inclusion in the review if they reported an investigation of the repeated exposure to or a repeated manipulation of sweet taste through foods and beverages in the diet, if they also included a comparator, if they included a subsequent measure of perception, acceptance, preference, choice and or intake of other sweet foods and beverages, and if they were conducted in humans over the age of 6 months. Now, importantly, we were interested in sweet taste per se. So again, source of sweet taste didn't matter. Articles looking at sugar, articles looking at sweetener consumption, and articles looking at naturally sweet tasting food items such as fruit were all equally eligible. We were only interested in studies that looked at repeated exposure, and we were only interested in studies that looked at subsequent measures in other sweet food or beverage items. We were looking specifically for a generalised sweet tooth preference or intakes. We used standard good quality research review methodology to do the review. So basically all work was undertaken by 2 individuals independently, and then agreements were checked. We also measured risk of bias, or judged all of the studies on risk of bias. We also registered our protocol in advance, following a little informal peer review as well. Our searches were most recently conducted in August 2017, and we ended up with over 20,000 potential articles that could be relevant to this research question. After a lot of screening, we whittled them down to 19 articles, as you can see towards the bottom, which detail 21 different studies, 7 population cohort studies, and 14 controlled intervention studies. Of our 7 population cohort studies, 3 of these were retrospective, so they assessed outcomes at the time and asked individuals to retrospectively recall exposure at an earlier time point. And 4 of them were prospective, so they assessed exposure at the time and then followed individuals up for a variety of years or a variety of timeframes to subsequently measure outcomes. Importantly, our prospective cohort studies were all conducted in children, and they all assessed limited aspects of the diet, so they asked for typically frequency measures of individual sweet food items. Of our 14 shorter controlled intervention studies, we had 9 that were relatively short term, which we defined as 30 exposures or an exposure period of less than 30 days. And then 5 of them were longer term, lasting, as you can see at the bottom there, up to 6 months. These longer term ones were all randomized control trials or secondary analyses of randomized control trials, with the exception of the second one in the table there, which was just a non-randomized clinical control trial. So from the evidence that we have, does dietary exposure to sweetness in humans impact on the subsequent generalized acceptance, preference, choice and or intake of other sweet foods? From the longer term studies, we have very limited evidence that's largely equivocal. From the population cohort studies, we have limited evidence that's largely equivocal. From the shorter term intervention studies, we again have limited evidence that suggests a higher exposure to sweet taste results in reduced preferences, not increased preferences, but also no impacts on sweet food intake. So from the work that we've done, there is currently no evidence to suggest any association between sweet food exposure or sweet taste exposure and subsequent preferences and intakes for other sweet food items. The recommendations that are there, as Paul has already suggested, are there based on a lack of evidence. So there's something here that needs to be changed already. What was interesting, though, also, or one of the main findings from the review, was that in actual fact there's very little evidence available here. We found only 21 different studies, which included just short of 3,500 individuals, so it's really not a lot of evidence available on which to be making recommendations. The evidence that was there was also highly heterogeneous. There's a lot of variety between studies in terms of both methodology and in outcomes. Much of the research also addressed our question only very indirectly. It was really looking at or aiming to study something else. Many of the studies also received judgments of very high risk of bias. What's also interesting, particularly for today, very few of the studies involved a manipulation of the taste of the whole diet. Most of them looked at just individual food or drink components. Only 2 studies, in fact, tried to or manipulated the taste of the whole diet. One relatively short-term intervention and then one of the longer-term interventions. Also, interestingly, few of the studies assessed perceptions of sweet taste by those actually consuming the diets. and none of the studies looked at sweet taste intensity or the strength of sweet taste across the diet. So more evidence is needed. More evidence particularly is needed that characterises dietary sweetness or that enables some measurement of dietary sweetness to allow kind of comparisons. So this, of course, brings us on to today. We really do need a meaningful measure of dietary sweetness. The ones that we currently have most often used are food frequency questionnaires. These are questionnaires that measure the frequency with which people consume individual food items. So in this case, sweet food and often beverage items. The difficulty with these measures, though, is that they often fail to take into account portion size or amount consumed, and they very rarely take into account aspects such as sweet taste intensity. No food frequency measure that I'm aware of looks at sweet taste intensity as well. By comparison, you can see there are taste-based databases also available, where panels have essentially tasted and rated a whole range of different foods on a number of different attributes, including sweet taste, to provide essentially a score for the strength of the, in this case, sweet taste of any particular food or drink item. So what we really need as a measure of kind of dietary sweetness is some combination of amount consumed with sweet taste intensity. And I shall give you some further questions at the end as to whether that's going to be enough. But there are two studies of which I'm aware that have currently done this, and there are others possibly available coming out about now. The two on the screen, though, they're Yuan et al. 2016 and Van Langeveld 2018. The study by Yuan attempt to characterise the French diet, the sweet taste of the French diet, specifically in French children. And they used a measure of sweet taste intensity for about 1,700 foods, in combination with food frequency measures. The study then suffers the same kind of problems as is accounted for by food frequency measures in general. The Van Langeveld study, by comparison, looked at combining sweet taste intensity with measures of energy intake. So this one, again, a measure of sweet taste intensity, this time in combination with energy intake, a better measure of amount consumed, arguably than frequency of consumption. But we still, and I think this possibly is the best measure we currently have, but arguably there are problems here as well, specifically for sweet taste. Of course, for sweet taste, we can consume some very sweet tasting food items that contribute zero energy or very little energy to the diet. I'm thinking, of course, of zero-calorie beverages, but some low-calorie desserts will also be the same. They'll offer a lot of sweet taste, but very little energy intake. So it may be that energy intake isn't the best measure of measuring amount consumed specifically for sweet taste. It may be good for some consumers and in some cultures, but possibly not all. So an alternative might be to look at weight consumed instead of energy consumed. We don't have any, I've got two sets of kind of unpublished data up on the screen now. The first, the written data, is data from a study that I've recently conducted, or we recently completed this study. It's currently being written up. But in the study, we asked individuals to eat freely from a buffet meal where we provided individuals with both sweet and non-sweet food items. And we wanted to look at the proportion of sweet food consumed. You can see if we look at proportion based on energy consumed versus weight consumed, we do get different values. I'm not suggesting either one is better than the other one. I simply want to demonstrate there's a difference here. The other data that we have there, data from John Hayes. Thank you very much, John. And what I want you to look at here is essentially the first two bars of this chart. This is a measure of sweet taste intensity of different sucrose solutions. Each of the sucrose solutions has the same amount of sugar in it, You can see at the top 0.92 grams. But if you look at the first chart, the first bar, the 0.92 grams is dissolved in 10 mils of water, and in the second bar in 20 mils of water. The sweet taste intensity ratings differ quite a bit, as you can see. So if we look at, this energy component, or the energy contribution of these two solutions is the same. The weight is very different. So if we combine the intensity ratings with the energy, we'll get very different values to if we combine the intensity ratings with the weight. Again, it's simply a demonstration that these two things are different, and we need to think carefully about how we're going to measure, essentially, amount consumed. Okay, if we look also at the sweet taste intensity side, Paula is going to talk a lot more about this, and I think Kay's as well. But kind of as a way of introduction, sweet taste intensity side of the equation isn't easy either. Suzanne has already suggested there are a lot of complications here, but just to point out a few of them. Firstly, sweet taste intensity can vary widely in different products, not just across different products, but within the same product. So sweet taste intensity will vary dependent on growing conditions, harvesting conditions, natural ripeness for naturally occurring sweet products, but will also differ, of course, dependent on product specification and so on. Sweet taste intensity can also vary as a result of other tastants and food textures. Suzanne's already given some nice examples of this. The best example of a variant of sweet taste of other tastants, I think, is tonic water. Tonic water contains about the same amount of sugar as other carbonated beverages, particularly fruit-based carbonated beverages, but doesn't taste as sweet as a result of the quinine, bitter-tasting quinine in tonic water. Again, if you're not convinced by your own experiences, we have some nice data from John, where if you look at the third column on the chart, you can see the perceived intensity ratings for sucrose solution with quinine added into it, compared to the first bar, which is exactly the same solution, but just without the quinine. There are other examples of the same type of combination of tastants within a food product or a beverage product. If you add milk to a coffee-based beverage, for example, the intensities of sweetness will increase. If you add a vanilla flavour to a milk-based beverage, the sweetness intensity will increase. So there are a lot of variations here, a lot of potential complications. By texture as well, Suzanne's already mentioned this as well, there are differences dependent on textures. So the optimal sweetness concentration for solids is typically much higher than that for beverages. There are questions as well about who it is who should be making these ratings. So the chart we have from John is based on consumers, and you can see from the chart nicely wide variation between between individuals. There is a consensus towards obviously where the means are, but some people are making vastly different ratings. Much of the work that's been conducted here so far has been conducted using trained panels, but there are arguments now that maybe we should be using consumer panels instead. At the end of the day, it's consumers that are consuming diets in the real world. It's consumers that are going to experience health outcomes or suffer from health conditions. So there's a lot of merit to thinking more about consumers than about trained panels or isolated measurements and so on in artificial scenarios. There are benefits to using consumer panels. Of course, they don't require training. They may be more appropriate. There are potential issues with consumer panels, of course. Consumers will be more affected by context or by situation. But again, this might be entirely appropriate. In the real world, that's what people are doing. Consumer panels will be particularly valuable, of course, if we want to look at individual differences. If we want to look at things like differences across cultures or differences across ages, these types of things, consumers will be more valuable. To go back to thinking about dietary sweetness as a whole, there are questions as well then about which of these two combinations, if we want to say dietary sweetness is a combination of amount consumed versus sweet taste intensity or in combination with sweet taste intensity, which are they equally important, or is one more important than another one? Is intensity more important, or is the amount consumed more important? And this is a question we really can't answer at the moment. We don't know the answer, and we can't answer it without a good measure of dietary sweetness. The other kind of added complication or added questions that I've put up there is the impact of behaviours. So again, if we're thinking about consumers, is consumers that are consuming products in the real world that really we need to be concerned about? But consumers don't consume products in isolation. They consume diets. It's a comment that's come up already. It's consumers that will be combining products together to result in tastants that combine together. It's consumers that are adding milk to their coffee, for example, to change the sweet taste of that particular item. It's consumers that are adding lemon to their tonic water to again change the sweet taste of that item. So we need to think about consumers. But something else that's particularly important is we need to think about the aspect of consuming. We're not just talking about individuals, but if I consume, for example, if I consume my sweet drink over 2 minutes compared to 2 hours, is that a different exposure? Is an added complication? Similarly, if I consume my sweet beverage intermittently throughout a meal, does that make my savoury meal now a sweet meal compared to if I consume my sweet beverage just in the 2 minutes at the start or just in the 2 minutes at the end? Similarly, if I consume my sweet beverage at the end of the meal, even if just for 2 minutes, and the sweet taste then lingers all afternoon, is that different to had I finished my meal with a coffee and the lingering taste was one of bitterness? So unfortunately, it's not even as straightforward as worrying about amount consumed and sweet taste intensity. There are other issues going on here as well. Maybe we do need to think about duration, but other practices as well. So I sort of said at the start I would attempt to answer one question but provide you with a lot more. But it's definitely an interesting topic area, something definitely as well where we need some more work. A more comprehensive or more meaningful measure of dietary sweetness will allow us to look much better at associations between sweet taste exposure and subsequent preferences and intakes. Such a measure would also allow us to look at associations between sweet taste exposure or dietary sweetness and other dietary outcomes, but also health outcomes. So it is possible, for example, that dietary sweetness or sweet taste exposure has impacts on things like fat consumption or salt consumption. And it's very possible if we reduce our sweet taste consumption that actually our fat consumption might increase or our salt consumption might increase. And these are important, of course, important public health questions. In terms of outcomes, it would be nice to be able to directly associate dietary sweetness or sweet taste exposure with cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, these health outcomes that are currently just suggested. So a more comprehensive measure of dietary sweetness, vital for public health agencies to allow the development of evidence-based recommendations, but also a potential interest, of course, to the food industry for considerations in product formulation and so on. Okay, with that I will finish. I'd just like to thank my collaborators on the review and the funding we received to do the review in the first place and have subsequently received to disseminate it. Offer my email there if anybody would like a copy of the review, can't access it, or has any comments in general, and thank you for your attention.